Before we start this final discussion, that we will end like all events with a disappearing app and a blackout, not without a reference to Slack and the continuing debates there, we'd like to share a few remarks.
First, this is not the end, this is the beginning. PGC 2020 might be over, but Crisistalk will continue.
The contributions to this conference will not catch dust on YouTube. We will curate them, make them available in indexed form. We will start a podcast to continue the discussion. We will publish books. We will bring in new voices.
We will write, print, speak, sing, shout. This is a call for action. Expect to hear from us. We expect to hear from you.
So this is not the end. This is a start. In very Arendtian terms, a moment of natality.
We'd like to say thank you to the president of AUP, Celeste Schenk, for her support of this endeavor.
To the communications department at AUP and especially Kilian Ordelheide.
To the provost of AUP, Bill Fisher, who provided invaluable advice during the planning stages of this conference.
To Amical, Jeff Gima and Alex Armstrong, who literally had sleepless nights during this past weeks.
To the International Society for Theoretical Psychology, the intellectual home for many of us.
To all of you out there, we have made it from New Zealand to Hawaii, the long way around.
We want to thank our volunteers who have worked tirelessly in the background and kept this event going. You're a wonderful group of people. You came together and self-organized the panel sessions and helped out wherever help was needed.
We want to thank our fellow co-organizers.
Zachary Beckstead in Hawaii.
Yas Igarashi in Japan.
Fu Wei in Hong Kong.
Athanasios Mavakis in Greece.
Pina Marsico in Italy.
Maike Watzlawick in Germany.
Ernst Schraube, Nicholas Kimmery, and Caroline Demuth in Denmark.
Maria Medved in France.
Robert Bashara in the United States.
Antonia Lareng in Chile.
Friends, let us meet you with a quote by Burt Reynolds. They say it ain't never been done before. Well, it's because we ain't never did it.
Thank you to the panelists. Your events were beyond what we organizers ever imagined. Brilliant, creative, witty.
We want to thank our keynote speakers. The list of names we're tempted to read out as we have done in front of the screen in disbelief so many times. Thank you for coming together virtually in Paris.
Last but not least, we want to thank all of you out there, our audience, for sharing this with us, for bringing your questions to the table. We hope you enjoyed this conference at least half as much as we did. Let's take what we have learned and move forward.
And forward we move with the statements of our panelists. If you can please turn on your video and your microphones and join us.
Martin, you have to turn on my video.
And is your microphone working now? Can we hear you?
Hi. Martin, you have to turn on my video.
It doesn't.
We can hear you. Okay, I think we can't hear Ian. So Nandita, if you're up, maybe you can start.
Yeah, I think I'll do that. I thought I could hear some sounds from Ian when the video opened. Anyway, Ian?
Hi, Nandita, hi.
Hi, so since you are now audible, why don't you go ahead and set this in motion? Is that okay, Martin? And I'll...
Yeah, that's okay. I mean, this has been a really great initiative to put on this conference. Clearly, it's a way of bringing academics together who are involved in critical work of very different kinds. The talks that I've seen have been really, really interesting, and they've taken psychology in a really good direction. That is, they've been able to step aside from psychology as such, and instead of simply applying psychological knowledge, which is the usual game of psychologists, what people in this conference have been doing is thinking about the role of psychology in relation to crisis. And of course, many of us have been focusing on the COVID-19 crisis. But there's another aspect to this that is important, which is that we haven't simply taken the humble step of trying to fit psychology as a little bit of the jigsaw into the rest of the academic map, which I think is a mistake that some critical researchers try to make, as if there's still a little psychology spaced bit left that needs to be put into the big picture. Rather, I think we've been aware that the academic map draws the world in such a way as to mislead us about the nature of reality. Reality is not divided up in the way the academic world is divided up into geography and history and sociology and politics and psychology. Yeah, you have to think in a different way about the relationship between these different approaches to subjectivity and to change. And the other aspect that's been really important about this conference is that it opens up psychology not only to debates in other academic disciplines, but it opens up to the question of practice. Time and time again in the questions after the speakers and in the panel sessions, the question has risen, so what do we do? You know, what's the action that will result from these ideas? How does the action feed into the theory that we're developing in the first place? So I've really enjoyed it. I hope that other people as participants have as well. And I think that it's been a step forward to thinking about the relationship between psychology and the world in a different way. Very, very hopeful event. Thanks for organizing it.
Thank you, Ian. Should Martin, do you want to say something or should I go ahead? Okay. So I'd like to start where you ended. Thank you very much to the organizers, but I'm not going to waste time on that. I'm going to start with the debate that I had. I'm going to jump right in. A debate that was initiated after Sunil Bhatia's presentation. Somehow I've been thinking about this over the past year, but more seriously now, I think that we have to choose our battles in psychology. And one of them, I seriously believe that it's time to drop decolonization. Somehow we, by continuing with past struggles in psychology, from my perspective, I think it's about time we take on the fresh enemy, so to speak. We have, when we continue with past injustice, current issues become obscured. So I seriously think that it is time, although Sunil doesn't agree with me, and I'm not saying post-colonial studies need to be abandoned, not at all, but as far as psychology is concerned, maybe we need to press the refresh button. Another thing I wanted to talk about, which came up actually in listening to some of the talks and another thing I've been thinking about is that the way in which psychology has become fragmented, the way in which it has changed over the years. I want to take the example of cross-cultural psychology, cultural psychology, and indigenous psychology. Why do I bring that up? Because as a person from India, I can't be seen by the international community as a psychologist because I have culture and, they have psychology. So somewhere this has permitted psychology, whatever mainstream psychology, to continue as if it can be understood without culture. So every time there is a rebel group, I think a small society is formed. They're given their conferences, their journals, their associations, and they talk with each other. But the main body of psychology, perhaps as APA, would be the leaders in that. They persist in, acting as if culture is insignificant. That's the second point I had. The third issue that emerges actually from an old 1996 publication by Kenneth, Gergen, and Girishwar Mishra and colleagues about thinking globally and acting locally, or was it the other way around? Every time I confronted that publication, I thought about the fact that, somehow global, from again, I'm speaking from the perspective of an Indian psychologist working in India. Science is seen as global and culture is seen as local. And that, again, it has resulted in this perception by people within the country that, they do science and we have culture. So it's linked to the earlier statement. And I think that again, two important phenomena become invisible. One is that there is a global culture which is actually local in its origin, but it is, it acts globally. And the second is the local science. Somehow the broad base, let's just take a look at the history of psychology. The history of psychology and its links to Western philosophy are very clear. I mean, you have all your names, and if you want to be part of that community, you have to be fluent in Western philosophy. Somehow, I mean, yoga, you can practice yoga to, make your body feel better. But if as a psychologist, I bring in yoga as a psychological explanation, because it has a lot to say about the psyche, it is seen as associated with religion or spirituality, not just by the international community. I think left-leaning academics, even within India, would be uncomfortable with bringing in, associations with religion. But that we fail to acknowledge the fact that Western philosophy also has links with Western religions. And somehow we need to resolve that. We need a broader base of what history we acknowledge, we use in our ideas, because unless we do that, we're going to be left, with narrow explanations for something like this. I mean, it has taken a virus to put some of this together. And lastly, very briefly, I want to talk a bit about how psychology is taught and practiced in my country. As Sunil pointed out yesterday, we continue with the teaching of Western psychology, with some notable exceptions, thank God for that. But more than that, it is what reaches the public. I think academics are not actively watching what the public, what psychology is reaching the public. The neuroscience and the measurement scales, they're being used all over. Industries are still using, business management institutes are using, the hierarchy of needs. They are conducting their training. Attachment theory is used for intervention programs with families. I mean, why is it that in the practice of psychology, some of us have taken a backseat? I think we need to be seriously engaged in these issues. Thanks. That's all I have to say right now.
Okay, I'm supposed to pick up for me. Thank you, Nandita. Thank you, Ian. And thank you, organizers, for being included in this. All right, let me pick up on the issue of crisis. At the very beginning, when I was told that this is a conference on crisis or plural crisis, I said, don't do it. Don't do crisis, do uncertainty. And that was the pitch of my contribution, because crisis has a particular contour, that of a narrative, and there's a pre and a post of the narrative that is characterized as normal. And the crisis is something that we manage. Now, this morning, waking up and hearing on CNN the characterization of what we are going through right now in the United States as a crisis on top of the pandemic crisis, I think brought it more clearly into focus. This is not a crisis that we have right now after Monday last week. It is a state of uncertainty of how are we differentiating and integrating a sense of self within this nation state. Let me, for a second, when I signed up to become an American citizen, that was 6 years ago, I was kind of aware that I was not leaving my post-Holocaust German past behind. That's still traveling with me, but also that I was signing up for a identity in a post-slavery society. Now, this is going on for people who grow up here, white, black, brown, for all these decades within which they are trying to make sense, navigating a sense of who they are. Yeah. So for me, this is something that I grew up into over the last 30 years being here, but it is something now I feel ready to speak to and address. Yeah, and not address anymore as race is a problem, race is an issue, but a clear voice of anti-racism that is, when it comes to actions, required. Now, as a psychologist, because that's what you asked me. Typically, as a psychologist, I think we have 3 identities. I only have 2. I am not a clinician. I'm not a therapist. So I also feel, nevertheless, that I can speak to that critically. And if we have the time, I may. But I am, first of all, a researcher. I'm doing my work in inquiry, and I am a teacher. And by the way, I think the teaching aspect of our identity has fallen a little bit short over the last 10 days. It surfaced a couple of times. So I want to take particularly issue with that. But first, as a researcher, I think that this is a particular type of action within the realm that is given to me institutionally. I'm designing the topic of my research or the topic of my inquiry, my interest, as the person, the individuum, as positioning themselves agentively, but at the same time being positioned within the realm of master discourses, where there is a possibility of constructing counter positions, counter discourses. But in addition to doing inquiry exactly into this dynamics, which is not digging into the interiority, but it is digging into what is happening when people are interacting in the world. Within this realm of inquiry, I also, with my students, can inquire what are the kind of dangerous and hegemonic discourses, whether they are master or counter discourses. Yeah. So within this dynamic, we can do and be critical psychologists and, of course, theoretical psychologists. So that is the realm within which I see myself operating within the institution that is giving me the opportunity to be a psychologist. Good. The second one, my second leg as a teacher. And I think this is where we are engaging ourselves in learning practices with our students. Yeah, these are highly institutionalized and as such constrained. Nevertheless, I think in this country in particular, within the tradition of liberal education, I see a lot of opportunities, not just as teaching the knowledge of the world and different cultures within psychology, the domain, but the skill sets that are outlined by the Association of American Colleges and Universities, adopted over the years now by the APA and outlined there in writing, they have become part of my institution's identity. Yeah, these kinds of skill sets as learning goals. I'm going to list a couple in a second. But I first want to alert to that these kinds of goals of what we are engaging when we are engaging in teaching and learning are part of a space within which our institutional or the psychology curriculum that each department is designing for themselves, then my syllabus adopting and nesting itself within these, and then particular units and even particular days in class are designed around this. So these are the parts of the skill sets, like learning how to fail. Keith Berry brought that up, and I'm very grateful for that. Learning to communicate across differences. Divergent thinking, the video by Ken Robinson, I think, is a fantastic one. But then there's one, and that inspired me to also pick on uncertainty, to be able to manage complexity and uncertainty. And I think if we put this deep into our teaching agenda, then we also can relate this to the agenda that my colleagues who are clinical psychologists may design as their agenda, moving away from healing internal, interior problems of the person to people in action, in interaction, relational, as Ken and others put it. And they're looking at their positioning, at the way they manage their uncertainty in their everyday lives and in their discipline. Now, one more second on the therapeutic ethos, because I tackled that in my presentation. And I got a little bit of responses here. My argument there was, and still is, as long as the traditional discipline of psychology, now not the research, but the practicing psychology identity of psychologists, as long as they are bedfellows of the self-help industry and not clearly demarcating their identity from the profit industry, I think we are in deep trouble, because these are the kinds of motives that are picked up by the public, and they are picked up by 16, 18-year-olds coming into the institution, the academy, and want to learn about psychology. So we have to start and work on the current discourse of psychology that is public, that takes the interiority as the core principle of psychology. And we have to turn that into the practices that are mundane, that are everyday, where we as psychologists anchor ourselves and where we anchor our participants in our studies and in reality, and design who we are in terms of the actions that we are putting forth.
Corinne?
Thank you very much, Michael, for that. And thanks again to the conference organizers. This has been a really engaging 10 days, and of course those days can continue, which is great. I love the kind of longevity of this project. I think something that's come out of it for me very strongly, almost at every point, has been, you know, the qualifying of psychology by who owns it or who's making it and for whom. That's been really important for me in the context of the current COVID situation in the UK, where psychologists have been very prominent actually under the name behavioral scientists. And their main contribution has been to emphasize the cognitive limitations of ordinary people. That's been highly unproductive, I would say. You know, it's led to some disastrous decisions. But there have been very different, productive interventions by some social psychologists around collectivity and trust, for instance. And I'd say also that really the best psychology around the pandemic in the UK has come from non-psychologists, has come from public health, has come from the people who arranged and then stopped Clap for Carers, a very solidaristic initiative, started in fact by a yoga teacher. And the many, many mutual help and aid organizations all over the country, which were started by a variety of people, but first of all, quite young feminist activists started those. So, and kind of in conjunction with that, I think that some of the aspects of the term crisis can be a little bit qualified if we turn away from it towards the term emergency. Crisis is a very naturalizing term around inevitability, and it also tends to have a kind of individualized characteristic that is, can be quite problematic. Locally, in the local state, there are many organizations that are very skilled around emergency. They already have long histories and ways of dealing with emergency. There's environmental emergency organization, public health emergency organization, GPs deal with health emergencies all the time. I think really to reify crisis out of that ongoing history and knowledge of emergency isn't always that helpful. And then again, in relation to psychology, is it really a thing? I think a lot of what we've been talking about has also been who owns and speaks to and within and for academia rather than simply psychology. Within the COVID epidemic, to some extent, one can see people using the symbolic capital of academia in positive ways. That's certainly happening, I think, sometimes. But really, the kind of academia that, as in other health emergencies, one could say, is the World Health Organization is a good example of how this has happened. The kind of academic interventions that are most productive, I'd say, are ones that are also allyships or advocacies or activist kinds of academia. And when one gets involved with that, at the same time, one has to give up quite a lot. And I hope people are starting to see that that's what's going to happen in a way. Yeah, we can do everything on Zoom, but we might also want to stop looking for high impact journal publications, research council funding, actually stop or cut back on all this stuff, funding for, those classic, and now we can see, right, ridiculous trips that Northern academics used to take all over the world to conferences. Truly excessive and ludicrous, meaningless expeditions that they went on. A few days ago, Akhil Mbembe, who's at University of Wits in South Africa, wrote about this and about the overturning of structures of academia in this time, and suggested that Northern academics are going to have different kinds of ownership and agenda shaping and input into academic debates. And I think that's a very interesting thing for us to think about and collectively to engage with. Thanks.
Okay, I'm going to keep this under 2 minutes. I spoke about the two bodies of the coronavirus in my presentation, drawing on Ernst Kantorowicz's The King's Two Bodies. We have two bodies as academics. We have our split subjectivity, as Lacan would say. We have our body of enjoyment, our political body, our raced or gendered or colonized body. And we have our intellectualist body, our learned body, our teaching body, our student body, our body of language, our digital body. In our crises today, climate change, the coronavirus, anti-Black racism, the recent deaths of George Floyd in Minneapolis and Regis Korchinski-Paquette in Toronto, we should maintain solidarity, critique, and also continue to think, to write, and to teach. We shouldn't collapse one to the other, but keep the antagonism, the split of the two bodies operative. Thank you.
Hi, so it's my turn. The way I understood our meeting tonight is what are the points I'm taking from this long and very interesting event. And I came up with 4 points. The first one is how similar we all are. Although we sit each one in one study or kitchen or office or where have you all over the globe, I felt that there was so much similarity among us in terms of how we approach this topic. For example, talking about uncertainty or looking at something much more empirical, talking about violence against women, and other topics that I said, oh wow, but we all have it, and I have it too. And I think that coronavirus, as Michelle and her partner said last night, has exposed a lot of the existing similarities, and especially crises and issues that need our solution. And among them, inequality. I mentioned in my talk ageism and violence, aggression, as you see today in the US, all these things that are common to us all. And I think it's very gratifying. That was the first point. A second point has to do with the fact that this is a conference which took place at the same time that the phenomenon we are discussing is really unfolding. For example, in Israel, 2 days ago, we felt it all over, and today they talk about the second wave, and we are really deep inside. And I'm asking myself how, as academics, as psychologists, we are performing when we are not talking about something that is well cooked and baked after several years of writing and rewriting and doing research, but jumping right into the present. The present is confusing, and it's often foggy and multi-sided, but at the same time, it is very fresh. It has a lot of enthusiasm. There are lots of emotions. The body is part of it. So I think this is how many of the talks were so engaging. I feel that we touched essential issues like my life, my health, the future of my community, the future of my children. So these kind of things don't open up so easily in normal conferences that we all go to. The third point is a question, where do we go from here? And we talked a little bit in our discussion about our part to our optimist and pessimist. Let us put this aside. And I think that in the question, where do we go? The first answer is research, research. We really talked, I did from my head or from my heart, but as many of you here presented wonderful ideas, we should take them to the classrooms, to our students, to our graduate students, or ourselves if we are active in research, and start to open this into small packages that are managed in research. It can be quantitative or qualitative, I don't mind, but I think that there are a number, and maybe Martin can collect them, tens and maybe hundreds of research questions that came up in this talk. The second way of what do I do with this is changes in my own life or in my own community. We talked a bit about, is change going to come? In the Jewish tradition, there is a term tikkun. Tikkun is to repair something, to make better. Are we really learning some lessons which will help us to be better and to make our world better? At the same time, all I hear in the Israeli radio for the last 3 days is going back to normal. In Hebrew, chazara, go back, go back. So this is, of course, a very natural human tendency to go back to normal, to go back to my routines. And it's a shame. I think there are some changes that we can make. And the third thing for where do we go from here is the influence. Here I talk to those of you who have a voice in government, in towns and cities, in big schools or small schools. How can we influence policy? How can we influence authorities, medical authorities, financial authorities? Because we have so much knowledge. So let us try to reach out with it. And my last point, which is number 4, is really to Martin and Irene and all the people who have taken part in organizing this. I felt in my age that I am in a brave new world. What? This kind of conference, this kind of conversation, and it's so quick and it has no borders whatsoever, almost no cost, at least not to us. And this technology is amazing. And it opens up so many possibilities. I love human contact face to face, and I would not want to live in a world that gives up this. But the addition of our technology has so many possibilities for us to explore, and we have been given an opportunity to test it. So thank you all. And I want to tell all of you panelists and others who are not present that I really feel a sense of community and kinship with all of you. Thank you.
Thanks, Amia. I feel that too. So I want to thank both the organizers and also my fellow panelists and all the other people who have participated in this. I actually hadn't prepared anything beforehand, but I've sketched out some things over the past few minutes. And the first thing I want to say as a kind of preface is just about everything I'm about to say is now overlaid with what's happening in the United States, in cities all over the country. I'm sure you know about at least a portion of it, the killing of George Floyd and so on. But there's a lot of new stuff coming out about who exactly the quote protesters are, about the place of white supremacists. And so as horrible as this latest event is, it also kind of blasts open lots of other issues. And those issues are the ones that are looming largest for me at this particular moment. About the conference, I want to say that it has been inspiring, significant, exciting, and humbling. And I'm thinking especially of the talks by Sunil, by Michelle, and a couple of others. In fact, it's been so humbling that yesterday I tend to think in titles, right? Yesterday I thought of doing a new essay called something like Lip Service, the inadequacy of my own theorizing. I don't want to get overly punitive about this. You know, I've done some writing on race in history and theory of psychology, you know, alongside Freud and Jung and Skinner. You know, I might assign a book like Liberation Psychologies. And I touched on a number of things even in my own talk that indicate some kind of social consciousness. But it really isn't enough. It really isn't enough, you know? The stuff I write about, even if it's embodied in the real lives of people, tends not to focus on people who are radically different than me. It tends not to be as oriented toward real world issues of race, class, gender, poverty, and so on. It's not as if I'm about to give up what I do. But as I say, it's not enough, and sometimes it feels a bit abstract and self-enclosed. So that leads me to the next point. I really do have an interest in working differently as a scholar, as a teacher, and so on. But I'm not entirely sure how. I'm not entirely sure how best to move forward, especially given all the good work that other people have done. I mean, I have no interest in being a kind of, interloper in a certain sense. And yet I've come to feel that I need to take my work in new directions. I feel that personally, but I also feel it on a kind of organizational level. I mean, Martin and Irene issued a call to action. And the question is, of what sort? Of what sort? Is it within the discipline? Is it beyond the discipline? Does it mean entering politics? Does it mean doing new kinds of work? And so on. And so it's just not clear to me what it means to kind of get in the game, so to speak. The final point I want to make is this, and this might be a function of the fact that I'm nearing retirement and so on. I still care about the discipline of psychology. I still care about reforming it, reconstructing it, making it more fit for human habitation, all the rest. But I actually don't care about it nearly as much as I care about the world. And so I haven't been writing as much about what's wrong with psychology or how the discipline might get better. And I certainly don't want to criticize those who do that. But I find myself somewhat less oriented in that direction. And that means finding new venues, perhaps more public venues for doing the work that I do. It also means doing new and different kinds of work. The work I do at this point, much of it is closer to the arts. And I'm convinced actually that the arts have a way into some of the large issues that we're talking about that maybe ordinary academic discourse doesn't. So I guess I'm in an exploratory phase, and I thank all of you in one way or another for helping me see a bit more clearly both what I've done and also what I need to do in order to be a more fully realized scholar, teacher, and human. So thanks.
Video. Okay. Well, I also want to thank the organizers and my fellow panelists for this conference, because it's been really important to me, if only just to get me thinking again. I was starting to think I was brain dead in all the isolation. I don't know if other people had that experience, but there was this sense of kind of a comatose state. And the preparation of a talk for the conference and also listening to everybody, the people that I've been able to hear, have really been energizing to me intellectually to be able to start to think again. And so I'm very, very appreciative of having had this opportunity. One of the directions that my thought has gone has actually been back to the people who do conflict resolution and large group dynamics, which we haven't talked about a lot in this conference, except obliquely. And sort of trying to think about how do we resolve all the splits that we are seeing in our country, in our world. And I was reminded of the fact that when I used to work more in conflict resolution, that people who do this work had always supposed that what it would take for the really different and opposing forces in the world to get together was some external threat. That generally, when it's something outside, people will then come together and resolve their differences. And so it had occurred to me early in this COVID-19 situation that we kind of had that. Generally, the conflict resolution people talk about an invasion from Mars, but this is kind of like that, not from Mars, but it's a shared threat. And it's a threat that is common to all of us, no matter where we are. And it looked like in the early days of the threat that people were coming together. We started to see a lot of cooperation among scientists, among doctors across the planet, trying to work together. And also to be helping those countries who were the first to suffer, and then those countries helping us and countries that were somewhat later to suffer. So it looked like there was something of a coming together. But that fell apart pretty quickly for lots of reasons. And now we find ourselves with the same old splits and some new ones, including this old one, which is really igniting fires, terrible ones, in the United States, and probably in other places too, that we're not as aware of. So clearly the shared external, in this case, microscopic threat, has not brought us together. So that to me is still the overarching question, is what do we need to get together around some shared values, shared goals, and to promote welfare amongst us on a national, international, global level. And that, I think, is the big question, which I think all of the talks in some ways have alluded to. And I'm also aware now on a more personal level of this whole question about difference. And one lesson from those people who do conflict resolution is that what we have to do in order to resolve conflict is to ask the hard question, which is, how is the other right? And among us at this conference, we have done a lot of othering. We are pretty like-minded, I think, as a group, at least on a political spectrum. And we represent a particular way of looking at things. But we haven't been able to access how the other, that is those people whose policies and thinking we decry, how are they right? I'm not much able to do that. And at the same time, I'm aware that amongst us, although we are very like-minded, we have very different minds. And I know that as I've listened to many of your talks, I've been impressed by the intellectual acuity, and yet also the struggle to kind of join your thinking and to get into that way of thought. So even though we are alike in many ways, we're also very different. And how do we access those differences? How do we make sense of them? This, I think, would be an important place to start. And finally, I want to say, what happened to you, Michael, on uncertainty? I originally wanted to talk about uncertainty, but you already grabbed that title. So I had to think of something else. Although you talked about uncertainty very differently than I would have talked about it. And I really appreciated your thinking about it, because I think uncertainty is a really important concept. And I think that where we as academics have to be is in an uncertain position, because that's what leads us to ask questions. And I think that the danger of the relationship between psychology and politics in the case of crisis, which is our topic, is what I would call pathological certainty. That when we feel we're certain that we understand something, we're probably on dangerous ground. And that we're really much better to be able to take the humble position and to move back to our uncertainty, so that we keep asking about what we don't know, can't be certain about. And that if we can bring that to our teaching and our scholarship, that's a contribution that I think we can make to inviting other societies and our own society to taking a reflective position, which is thinking about where we are, where the other is, and how we can join together in some way. And I think that this conference has been a good example of our joining together. And I hope we can continue to stay joined and to think about how we can help the various subgroups of our world join in something like a shared mission, which right now is health and anti-racism and anti-poverty and a lot of the other perils that bedevil us. So that's what I'm coming away from this conference. Thank you.
I think it's me next. I think I'd like to start by, saying sort of I'm feeling a little bit fragmented given the political situation that's unfolding within the United States right now. In some ways, I feel I'm speaking from a very heavy heart, and that's what I wrote on my Facebook post after watching the public murder of, George Floyd and a 9-year-old girl, a Black girl who watched this public murder. And then I've been following all those events unfolding. And then I've been feeling somewhat fragmented and scattered. That is, how do we speak to a situation that is sort of not new? So I feel like I'm in mourning somewhat in this country right now. I'm feeling loss and mourning and grief as much every time I go. So when I woke up this morning, I was reading a letter written by an academic to that girl who filmed, and I think she was 9. I just was broken completely. Basically, the letter said is that this moment is not going to define you, and your community will be with you, and we will fight this in solidarity. So I started thinking about what solidarity means for us, at least for me personally. And I really was at a loss of words. There is a way in which you can theorize and do academic work, but there are ways in which, as I said in my talk, there are actual bodies that carry the disproportionate burden of suffering, which is hard to comprehend, that kind of grief and sorrow. So to me, I've been working on 2 pillars, I would say, of my work. One is anti-racist, which I started 25 years ago. And that thread comes mostly from trying to speak to the psychology of social inequality that is present in the United States, to find ways to be inspired by other psychologists, sociologists, by other people and scholars. So to me, one is, when we think about crises, is also to think about what are the implications of our theory, whom are we writing for? So to me, the part of doing the anti-racist work really stems from the fact that I am a child of a post-independent India. A generation before me fought British colonialism, so I had rights to go to college and education. I was doubly privileged, and then I came to the United States and I was a beneficiary of the civil rights movement. Somebody fought before me, and that history is my history now. So part of the work I do is contributing that legacy to that history that I've been a beneficiary of. And those are the kinds of questions I asked. How does racism live within South Asian communities? How does it live within Indian communities? What does it mean for subjectivity? These are small cultural political projects. That's how I started. I wasn't trying to change the whole of psychology. It was really about my own meaning making in the process. And when I didn't find psychology providing any answers to it because of the constraints, I went to other fields. I found so many people here on the panelists, their work to be so liberating, Michelle Fine, Mark and Ken Gergen and others who have been speaking about the cultural turn, the narrative turn, and so on. So to me, that has been a very powerful, I would say, tool to think about through what does an anti-racist psychology really mean. And the second piece of work, which has also been a parallel to that, it started both simultaneously, what I would call is anti-colonial work. So I see these are the two pillars to me, a way to contribute or the way to speak to the existing social inequalities. Others who have come before me have created this political project, whether you would call it through critical psychology, through cultural studies, and through others. So I draw on their theories and sit on their shoulders and their insights. So part of doing decolonizing work to me is very straightforward. I see the project, and that's where we had a small debate between Nandita and I yesterday, because after my panel, she asked me the question whether is it still relevant? And my answer to the question to her was, in 2008, when Obama was elected, everybody thought that we lived in a post-racial America. In the same way that we are not present in a post-racial America, we don't have racial equality, we cannot really seriously think about the kind of legacies of colonialism that's still with us. And so that's really important for us to kind of examine, which lasted for 400 years, 300 years. So it would take us at least for another 400 years before we begin to think about whether we have parity and equality and so on. So that's the second issue, I think, as a lens, personally, I think about in very deep ways. And part of the anti-colonial project for me is to understand the intersections between inequalities. It's not one slice of reality. It is racial inequality, it is social inequalities, caste identities. So somebody asked me a question yesterday about, why don't you look at it intersectionality? I think it's a really important tool to think about the different intersectionalities of multiple inequalities. But for me to go deeper, I have chosen a particular project through which I speak about this. So part of doing that, there are I think personally, there are two political projects to me. And I think many of you here are part of it, and many of you are working on it, and it's been very inspiring to be in conversation. One is really to understand psychologies of complicity with racism and colonization and colonialism. That project has just begun. We haven't yet started that. And in order to decipher or comprehend what our differences are, where we stand, what it means, I think we have to do the undoing. So it's not a surprise that you see so many of the South African psychologists in issue after issue have been speaking about one thing: how do we undo the effects of apartheid, colonialism, and so on. So to me, we need instruments and tools to really think through what does this undoing mean? And that's where I believe pointing out to the coloniality of psychology, not just psychology, but social science as a discipline and so on, is I think really an important move. And not just because I do it, but because I've learned from it through others. So for example, how do we speak about the lack of public goods, neoliberalism that's crushing so many people in the so-called global South and so on? What theories do we have to really speak very meaningfully? So to me, that's another lens that I really think through very deeply. And part of the undoing for me is the field, and then the embedded part of that is, I think, self-positioning, or where I've learned from my feminist colleagues, that is social location. How do I stand? Where do I stand vis-a-vis these political projects? And I think that articulation has been very important for me. So when I did my introduction to my book, Decolonizing Psychology, it's a personal introduction. That is, why do I write? What does it mean for me personally? And I take a very humble cultural humility approach to it, that I don't know much. So that's why I go outside my field to figure out what that means. So that's an important project of when you do undo, you can't just undo the field itself. You also have to start from, that's why I love Fanon's work, from decolonizing our own minds, the conditioning that's happened to us, to ask about our own complicity also, which we have begun to do in many of our academic institutions. So it's very difficult. So you can't really call out, for example, in me, if I'm working in a predominantly white institution, I need to name what that means before I do psychology. Part of the naming means it invites certain risk, but part of saying that it's a white institution that I work, it means you have to then speak about white supremacy, white rage, white fragility, white power, white backlash, and so on. But in saying that, you're already pointing to certain places where you can go for explanations, but also you're inviting risk of alienation. So is it possible for us to kind of have some kind of this symmetrical dialogue about psychology when our histories are so asymmetrical? So who would carry the burden, I would ask, one of the questions when we are rethinking psychology in asking this question? Because it's not a neutral question. If it's a political question, these questions are already being asked from different margins. So to me, that's a very important conversation to be had. And that's where, you know, and my last project is, of course, advocacy and political advocacy. And coming from where I am, I have last 15 years been working for a nonprofit organization that's very much involved in providing sanitation on the ground to 13 wards where I've lived with. So a lot of my theories that I'm thinking about come from when I go during my visits. So I have a chapter of that organization that I work with. And one of the projects that we have done is to really rethink what does it mean for individuals who don't have rights and who are written out of the so-called public census data. Just to give you a simple question, a simple example. You know, I've been very impressed with my colleagues to working with how do you do what they call is census mapping, or what's called intervention by documentation. There are close to 2 million people in my city who are not considered part of the census because they live in slums. How did that question come about that they are outside? Now, when I was in psychology and asked that question, I was told you can't answer that question because that's related to psychology, because that's economic question. But to me, it's a question of dignity. It's a question of labor. And so those are equally important questions. So to me, part of doing psychology is also finding ways of how do I invest my time, privilege, labor, capital in advancing some of these issues with people, not necessarily me dictating and saying this is how it to be, but with learning what I would call ethics of reciprocity, which is really very helpful for me, which I'm thinking about. So those are some of the things that I think I am where I am, and I'm thinking about personally for what inspires me. So I want to thank the organizers for giving me the chance to speak, and for many participants who wrote to me personally yesterday, and to many of you, whom I think we are sort of rowing the boat of psychology, I feel, in the same direction.
Okay, thank you, Sunil. And also thank you very much for situating us in this very, very current moment, and for articulating what I think many, perhaps all of us are feeling as well, which is the challenge of actually speaking to this conference while actually real life is rolling on, and indeed has rolled on quite a bit since we started speaking together 10 days ago. So the question which we were asked to think about, how do we situate ourselves as academics vis-a-vis times of crisis? Well, I guess, and I'm going to try to be quite brief here, but my answer would be really one word, which is rather uncomfortably. I think Corinne Squire gave a wonderful talk in which she really asked us to think again about what does the word crisis mean. And so even we could turn this question back and say, well, vis-a-vis times of crisis, as in which crisis, whose crisis, which crisis are we talking about? For whom is it a crisis? Is it a new one? How does it connect to other crises, et cetera? But let's just accept the question at face value. I'm going to go rather quickly through a set of what I have written down as my uncomfortable balances, or imbalances, I guess I would have to say. And the first one, and this has come up a lot in different talks. The first one, and these are all about this current moment for me, not only as an academic, but as a person. The first one is between basically hope and despair. Yesterday I had the joy of being with my daughter for her virtual graduation, and the wonderful human rights lawyer Brian Stevenson was the keynote, was the graduation speaker, and he turned to the class and he said, "Look, guys, hope is your superpower. without hope, you're not going to be able to do much. And I think that's true. And I think one of the big challenges of our moment is actually to find that hope. And, you know, Mark and I had this discussion earlier. I don't think hope is in any way synonymous with optimism. In fact, I think it's like hope in a critically based hope. But how do we find that? That's the first and most important imbalance for the moment. The second one is this challenge of being together while we're alone. And I mean this not only psychologically, but politically. How do we join forces when we can't physically gather? And what will that mean going forward? How can we actually, we already, you know, been questioning, what does the word solidarity mean? What does solidarity mean when we are physically isolated? The next one is between ignorance and knowledge. And I think Michael's, you know, putting uncertainty out there on the table front and center is really important, because one of the things I think that we need to be very careful about as academics is not pretending that we know more than we do. I do think that it's very important to claim an expertise that we do have, but also at the same time to situate ourselves with some kind of humility. And I have to say, and I think a number of you have also perhaps experienced this, that, you know, almost a kind of nausea and embarrassment of all the new calls for, you know, COVID-related grants and, yes, conferences and papers. And it's, you know, there's potential good there, but it's also like, you know, there should be a sense of humility as well about what we can contribute and how. A next one of these imbalances is between intimate space and public life. And right now, you know, we're all sitting in our homes, and yet we're very public. We are actually internationally public right now. And how does that, I mean, we've been talking for a long time about the, you know, the relationship between the local and the global, but how does that actually, how do we balance that in these challenging times? The next one is the idea as the tension between the everyday and the exceptional, when in fact the everyday has become the exceptional. And there's been a lot of critique, which I think is extremely important, about the talk about the new normal and actually resisting this temptation to go back to what was normal. People say when normal life returns, which normal life? And I think that is a really, really challenging question for us. And finally, the last uncomfortable balance, if you will, is a temporal one between past, present, and future. We see today, quite horrifically, historical injustices playing themselves out today in the present. How are those going to actually inform our ideas about how we are going to move forward? And I think that in my talk, I borrowed the phrase that we are in this acute turning point that, you know, we're sitting at the hinges of history. Change is happening. Which kind of change is it going to be? And the question that I would leave us with then would be, how do we imagine what it would be like if we collectively simply did not accept this anymore? And so that's my comments for now.
Yeah, thank you so much, Melanie. I'm not sure I'm on now.
You are.
All right, good. Yeah, I've looked at this conference as a landmark event in terms of bringing people together from all over the world with common concerns of this sort, and with the possibility of change in mind. It's been a fantastic run, and we all appreciate all the work that's gone into this, enormous. But now I listen to this colloquy and I realize right here is the basis for another conference of this sort. Right here is the chrysalis for the kind of dialogue which could change the discipline, which could change the way in which we do academic work, which could change the way we teach. and that I would hope that somewhere, somehow we can pick up on this and continue into the future. I also have got to say, I've been really touched this past hour by listening to these talks. I know most of the people who've talked here, but it's the level of openness and trust in each other, not posturing, the sense of wanting to connect with each other, that I'm really touched by it. It supports a view that, I mean, I've always doubted whether these kinds of Zoom conferences could work. I don't, it's horrible when you get shut off of Zoom, suddenly you're alone. I mean, you talk for an hour and a half and suddenly no one is in the room, and it's pretty brutal. But now this reinforces my idea that, in fact, perhaps there is a future here. I think I'd like to pick up on Michael's comments again on uncertainty, because I think that's a really good point, not to look at this as a narrative of crisis, but of uncertainty, because my own sense is that this crisis is just kind of a wake-up call. What we're calling a crisis is just another blip. And already Mark and others have commented on, look, we got our own problems here in the United States, which in the last 3 or 4 days have exploded. And that's to say nothing of a government which is almost totally dysfunctional, an environment which is crumbling at our feet, setting off all kinds of additional repercussions throughout the world. That this is the new normal. This is a wake-up call for what we can imagine for the future. That is, it will be one issue layered upon another issue, layered upon another issue, and they concatenate and they intersect, so that they're all related in some way. So that once we have a weather change, it affects what we can do about COVID, for example, and that affects the economy, and so on and so on and so on. Just one philosophic moment, because when you realize, to go back to Nita's comments about the very conception of knowledge that we in psychology inherit, which is one of a reasonably fixed world which could be known, which we could search and search again, where knowledge could be cumulative, so that what you find or write about at one point may in fact have some staying power and could build upon. I mean, it's the whole conception of journals, the whole conception of education as learning, as if those lessons accumulate, and as if we can stand outside of it and reflect on it and comment on it in some kind of more rational, reasonable, stable way, ideally nonpartisan. So that if you contrast that kind of conceptual knowledge with the world in which we are increasingly moving into, of rapid flux, of no understanding, because by the time you've tried to penetrate what's happening, it has moved. It's yesterday. So it almost demands a whole different conception of what we do as knowledge makers, our role in society, our role as teachers. That view that we can develop universal knowledge based on empirical fact from a neutral position, I mean, it's finished. I begin to think and have thought that how could we develop a way of thinking about what we are as knowledge makers in a privileged position, as moving with that flow, not trying to reflect on what it is so much, even though that's important, but trying to move it to the future. That is, being not mirrors to the world, but makers of the future, formers of what is going to happen. Not outsiders trying to comment, or even people trying to comment from a position, but actually making things happen. And indeed, I mean, some of my favorite people who do that are right here. Michelle and Sunil have been favorites of mine for a number of years. Fantastic. I also think that the kind of narrative work where you actually try to deal with a phenomena is there, not an abstract proposition, points us into our life with others in ways that earlier research did not. I also love Kieran's work, trying to actually work with government to create another kind of deliberation, which would become our future. Now, I said some of that in my talk, added some here, but now I get to the point of what Mark brought up, and it's been implicit in a couple of others. I think there's a point at which we really need to reflect also on what that would mean, what value invested work would mean for us, what future change would mean if we actually got into the flow and tried to create the future in a more direct way than most of us have heretofore. What does it mean in terms of our image as knowers? Do we now become just part of the babble of ideas that continue to flow, or do we have anything special to offer? Yes, Molly, we should be humble, I think, but there is something there. So all that becomes now a new, sort of a new agenda as to if we accepted a role as moving the world forward, because we are all clearly invested in what's going on and what will happen. What does that mean for discipline, for identity, for the kinds of pedagogies, for the kinds of ways in which we communicate with the world? So those issues are really quite fascinating to behold, and I really do hope that the organizers of this conference can be challenged to help us forward. So thank you.
Okay, I think it's me. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'd like to thank everyone for their generosity, especially the conference organizers. This huge, it's a very significant undertaking, and I'll address the questions. I did talk quite a lot in my own presentation about how I situated myself personally in relation to this situation. Now, as an academic, I see my role, as I always have really, as one of attending to the pernicious forms of psychology that circulate and within and inhabit popular culture and policy contexts and other professions and disciplines. I think that is something as an academic psychologist I have been able to offer as part of a significant role that we have as academics in demystifying the politics of knowledge production and interpretation. There's been a lot of talk, certainly in Britain, about following the science, but of course that treats science as an unscientific activity, as one that strips away the fact that it's an arena of contest and debate with multiple interpretations. And following the science has been a way of doing governance and governmentality. And we have a responsibility, I think, to expose those kinds of strategies and tactics and misuses of the discourse of academic knowledge. And what that also means is insisting on the wider connections between these different crises, which isn't only, of course, as everybody is saying, it's not just a health crisis, it's an ecological, an economic crisis around gender, racialization. I'm sorry, Nandita, I think we decolonization in decolonizing perspectives are just more, are more and more relevant at this, ever so relevant at this moment. Perhaps it's a different discussion to have with you about that. As a teacher, I think my role is one of modeling being a politically engaged academic. There is no neutral knowledge, as Ken was also saying. So there are, that enters, it has implications for our ways of teaching and learning. It has implications for our relationships with colleagues and with our students, that there is no neutral or innocent position. And the organizers, Irene and Martin, have said this is a call for action. And it's a call for action not only within the academy, but outside. I do agree with Corinne that non-psychologists have been the best psychologists, certainly in a British context, but we shouldn't romanticize also what happens outside just because it's not in the official domain of psychology. Now, also in terms of academics, here in Britain anyway, austerity is back. Universities are cutting jobs, salaries, increasing workload. And these are all practices that make critical thinking and critical work much more difficult. And this is just a reflection of what is happening outside universities. So I'm not to romanticize the outside or to say that universities are in a especially difficult position. They clearly are not. They are elite institutions. So all arenas are subject to these pressures. But I think we, the older generation, as most of us are in this panel now, have a responsibility to try and sustain some kind of critical scholarship and critical practice, but also to show by our practice that academics are engaged in political practices outside psychology with others. So I agree that with Michael Bamber that this is like a Magritte image. This is not a crisis. It's very much business as usual, isn't it? And I have colleagues in my university, good colleagues, who work in humanitarian disaster management training. It's a long-standing discipline. All of what we've been seeing is a small part of what has been going on in those othered places as part of historical and current neo-colonial relations. So that kind of intersectional analysis around racism, around gender depression, class defects, and so on. We already have these analyses. Well, what are we going to do about it? It's easy to feel this as a personal and interpersonal crisis, however, and I was talking about that in my presentation. And I do think we have to use this moment of potential demystification as one of conscientization and mobilization, and to build on the protest. So I think it's, in terms of the discussions around uncertainty here, it's all very well being humble, and I agree we need to acknowledge what we are beneficiaries of and understand the privilege of our position, but also to use that privilege. And equally, I think it's really important that we don't psychologize this crisis as psychologists. This is a crisis. If it is a crisis, it's a question of political economy and geopolitics that we have a responsibility to address inside and outside psychology. Thanks.
Thank you, Erica. I think it's my turn. I've really been moved by these accounts and all the commentaries that have preceded mine. I feel really humbled, and I don't think I have a whole lot, if anything, to actually add. But it is my turn. So Irene asked that, how do we situate ourselves as academics in a time of crisis? And I said yes when Irene asked, because not because I have an answer, but because I don't. And I was hoping that the other panelists will say things that help me out. And that indeed has happened. It has helped a lot. A number of these comments remind me of a comment that came up in my commentary for my talk. I spent a lot of time talking about the Camus novel, The Plague, and trying to sort of relate it to our current situation. And there's a line in there towards the end of the novel, I believe, where Camus says that, I think this is even after the plague has lifted and the city is now emancipated and people are celebrating in the streets and the pestilence has gone away magically, as it turns out. And I think the narrator says, but the plague is always with us. And yeah, I mean, the plague is always with us. The uncertainty that Michael talked about is always with us, and it's compounded, and there are layers and layers of it. And it is very impressive to hear all of you, how you embrace the challenge of trying to make sense of that uncertainty and trying to move forward in the world in a positive way, even though the plague is always with us. I'm a teacher, mainly, I think. Michael talks about teaching and research. I guess those are my two roles, teaching and research. I see teaching as primary because I feel that in my writing, I'm a lot of times I'm teaching, and in my research as well. And as a teacher with expertise, some expertise, although humble about it, as was suggested, I don't know where I position myself in the world more generally. I try to position myself as a societally engaged person who's trying to have some sort of positive impact or contribution to the current conversation, whatever it may be, that if it relates in one way or another to my expertise in personality and developmental psychology and the narrative study of lives. But, you know, in that sense, I identify with many other people who have a certain kind of special expertise in the humanities, in the sciences, and in the arts. And in the current environment, at least in the United States, expertise is consistently derogated. And so I feel more and more marginalized, not because I'm a psychologist and not because I study narrative, which is a little fringy maybe in psychology, at least in the mainstream, not with you folks, but because I have some sort of expertise, and all expertise, or much of it, especially that which is instantiated in universities, seems to be under attack by the current administration. I do teach in a program called Human Development and Social Policy. It's one of my roles, and going back over 3 decades, I've been affiliated with that program at Northwestern. The students of the program are trained to do policy relevant research in psychology, sociology, and education. There's a little bit of economics in there too. And the expectation is that the findings from their studies will inform public policy conversations in the United States. And, you know, sometimes that happens, but not that much really, even before the current administration. Most of the time, their findings and studies get ignored by the public, or else the findings are used by politicians to support a particular ideological position that they already favor. So they, you know, it's a kind of partisan weaponizing of this research that's done by these wonderful students at Northwestern, and I'm implicated in that. I'm part of that. I'm helping them do that research and so forth. And it depresses me a bit, always has, that we can't position that work more centrally into the conversations. But still, I want to put the doom and gloom aside there, because I do feel nonetheless privileged that to even have any kind of voice in all of this, and feel that academia provides me at least, and I think most of us with roles that hold the potential for positive influence and maybe even fostering progressive and enlightened political action, I have to kind of keep that faith going as a teacher and a researcher. And this conference, I have to say, has helped to bolster that, that faith. It's helped to reinforce it, or supplement it, or sustain it during this difficult period of plague. So thank you so much, Irene and others, Martin, who put this together, and it's a privilege. Thank you.
Dan, I'll try to be quick because we're all over. So let me begin by thanking Irene and Martin. I actually think this was a huge undertaking, but really important. And it will be important to treat this as an archive of criticality within psychology. I was encouraging them to, I don't know how we do this or you do this, but to create kind of critical shorts so that we can all teach this, or to take like a word like crisis across some of our talks, or violence, to piece it together. But affectively, I'm sitting where Sunil is. in a kind of puddle of rage and despair. And Amia, I think you can tell Netanyahu that the killing of George Floyd is a way to go back to normal for us. And the same patterns are cycling now. So there's a killing, we videotape it, we think the evidence might matter. The crowds gather, the protests gather, and now if we look on our phones, the militarized police are arriving. They didn't arrive when white supremacists walked white Congress people into their into the Senate in Michigan, but they arrived the moment people of color speak their outrage. And I'm afraid that is going back to normal. So there's a cautionary tale here for all of us around, and Erica, you asked it in your talk, around for whom is this news? For whom is this a crisis? Is it that those of us on this call are suddenly existentially destabilized in a way that so many people are existentially and financially and in terms of health and criminal punishment and immigration status destabilized? I don't know that life for children in the detention centers at our border is very different, except some of them are sick and we don't know about it. So affect. Been reading a book that I'm not sure I recommend, but it's a very important writer. His name is Frank Wilderson. He has a book on Afro-pessimism. And he asked the question, he's a Black academic, and it starts in a psychiatric institution, but he asked the question, how is it possible that in our country, we need to keep witnessing the lashing, the killing, the burning, the lynching of Black bodies to reestablish our humanity? And in the talk that Pulang and I gave yesterday, I think the same way about violence against women. I think that psychologists keep making this like, oh my God, look, it's happening, but it's happening. It's a slow but bloody moan that persists. And so when there's a camera out, or a famous white woman who's getting beaten, we suddenly treat it as a provocation. But as psychologists, we need to understand this as a sedimentary layer of human life, not just a rupture. Having said that, I think for me, the urgent questions that have gotten lifted by many of our talks that Corinne just noted is really, to whom are we accountable? As psychologists, because that's the kind of, that's the disciplinary carcass I sit in. I could go to other ones, but that's the one I live in. But to whom is our work accountable? A lot of you know I do a fair amount of work with prisons, activist work, but after Ruthellen's talk, I wrote her a note thanking her for a talk that was like an old sweater that created a kind of holding environment for the affective chaos and the existential crisis that we're all enduring. And it was a provisional sweater, but one that kind of created a space to hold us. And I do think that function of the Academy is important, to give folks a way to understand the present moment, even if we're wrong. So Ian did the same thing in his talk, attaching the current moment to neoliberalism, to the tension between the market and the state. So I have some homework assignments for us, because I'm coming toward the end. One is, I love the conversation with Pulang, and for those of you who didn't see it, you should watch it because she was just brilliant. Pulang was a student of mine and is now just a grown-up, brilliant goddess professor in South Africa. And she spoke about coloniality, and she talked about an African writer who talks about rearranging the colonial software in people's subjectivities, that the colonial project didn't rearrange the hardware, but the software, and decolonizing is reworking our interiors. So one piece of homework is we're better off having conversations with people outside the spaces we typically occupy. For me, that's women in prison, it's Pulang, it's folks who are deeply marginalized by the current moment, but new knowledges emerge in those engagements. Listening to Pulang, she knows all the citations we know, but she spoke using all these African scholars that none of us know, or maybe some of you know. I certainly didn't know. And in some ways, that's a global North, global South, the hegemony of the global North. In other ways, it's us kind of stewing in our own circles. And I do worry that it limits what we know and what we can know. I also think disaster capitalism is coming to your university the way it's coming to mine. So I don't think it's a selfish project for us to think through the ways in which all of our universities are going to use this moment of austerity to say, maybe you don't need brick and mortar. We shouldn't enjoy Zoom that much. Even though I actually am kind of enjoying it, because they could do away with our buildings, with our jobs. They're attacking our adjuncts. They're attacking contingent labor. They're attacking African-American studies. And that's a place we live, and that's a project we should be taking up. And as senior faculty, even if we are disgusted by the colonial and elitist history of the academy, we should be fighting for an academy that should be, not the one that has been, because the right would be more than happy to do away with all of us. More homework assignments. I think we have to contest the membranes of what constitutes the academy. We do a lot of work with social movements, with communities under siege. That is the work. I think we have to ask ourselves, to whom are we accountable? Whose knowledge matters? How do we begin to cite the wisdom and knowledge produced by people on the ground in struggle? I think we need more studies of solidarities. I think Ruthellen was saying in the beginning, people were helping each other and then we all got locked in our apartments. And I think that's true, although I still think there's a ton of mutual aid solidarity work happening all around us. But I think psychology has so instantiated the notion of the individual, self-motivation, selfishness, grit, advancement, that I think people need images of solidarities, and they're always fragile and they split in a moment. But I think we need to open the popular imagination around solidarities. And I guess maybe my last point, is this is a moment for elevating wisdom and knowledge that's being produced in places that are not the academy. And we have an obligation to work with the knowledge of a student of mine was working in a detention center in Texas, and all of the women circled with all of the children and they knitted caps. And they say in Spanish, if one of us, as some were leaving, and they all wear these caps, and as one of us leave, we all leave. And as one of us stays, we all stay. There's a wisdom. I'm working with formerly incarcerated women, and we're online trying to identify women who are either old or sick or eligible to be released and slide their names under Governor Cuomo's nose. And he is just ignoring us. But there's a wisdom in gathering formerly incarcerated women together to talk about who's still inside, who's vulnerable, how do we get the messages to them? There are networks and solidarities about which we as psychologists know very little. And if we've learned nothing else, perhaps this is an opportunity for us to engage with non-canonical knowledges and create a sacred space for those. So I wish us well, I wish us safety, and I hope we can interrupt the kind of repetition compulsion of watching all those videos. And tonight you'll be watching the military arrive in all those cities And perhaps part of our work is helping to imagine what other responses there might be, what other organizations of the academy, but also our social relationships, so that we're not relying on the carceral state, the corporate state, or the military to solve what are deeply human and inhumane problems. I'll stop there. I'll pass to Kieran. And again, I really want to thank Irene and Martin for bringing us together.
Thank you, Michelle. And I'll also echo everyone else to thank the organizers for a very special event. I don't think I've kind of felt as much connection with Zoom over so much long time. So I think you've really accomplished something special. A while back, I heard this from a friend, and then I've heard it several other people saying that the coronavirus is not political. That it's just biological, and I think what they meant by that is something actually quite. I think they actually meant it in a way of solidarity, in terms of, like, we all have to just let's not be political about this. Let's just deal with the problem. But of course, it is very political, and I think that's one of the things I've taken away from many of the presentations, even though I can in the abstract say it's political, but so many of the presentations really pointed to the specifics in how it is political and how it manifests. But with this kind of crisis talk of saying that the virus is biological, that's also, I think, what motivates all those granting calls and all those calls from journals saying, send us rapid stuff. We'll make a really strong effort to get this out quickly. As if we can deal with COVID as an isolated thing, and that's really something else that I've taken away from a lot of these presentations, is that it's been very clear that the old problems don't go away, and in many ways, I think, while I think there's a lot of good in these funding calls, there's also a potential distraction away from focusing on just this biological virus and not all the problems that it directs attention away from. And again, I appreciated the talk so much in terms of how so many of them looked at what does our attention, when we put our attention to COVID, what does it make visible, what does it make invisible, and how does it reconfigure existing problems, and how does it create new ones. One interesting, I also want to pick up on the uncertainty business, and I think Molly talked about this really nicely. Thomas Taylor uses the word epistemic humility in a chapter he wrote recently, in which he grapples with the issues of being humble about our academic contributions, at the same time as also recognizing the expertise. So not devaluing the expertise, but maybe situating it. And with a lot of the crisis talk, I think all of us are kind of called to, contribute your expertise to this. So we're all called to have something to say in the face of this. And I think there's a danger there that, as many of you have said, there's a danger here that we then maybe are so focused on what we have to say that we don't listen to what other people have to say, and that we are so fixated on our uncertainty as opposed to all the other contributions. And Erica, you also mentioned the danger of psychologizing, and I see this also very much. But I wonder also, by being called to say something, do we as psychologists then automatically psychologize in spite of ourselves? So I think, I'd like to say that what I'm left with in from this conference is some really, I guess, thoughtful contributions to how we continue from here, not only in our scholarship but in our actions. So thank you very much again to everyone.
Thank you so much for all your thoughts and sharing. And I really agree that this is a beautiful way of being open and sharing what is on our minds. And thank you so much. It was very, very inspiring. We really appreciate it. You all took a risk, and we're in this with us together, trying out technology, trying out new formats. So I really would like to thank you at this point. We are running out of time here, and still we could probably do that forever and forever. And this is what we want to do. And what we were thinking is, this is kind of the conclusion of the conference. And at the same time, we wanted to continue. So our very last question for this evening and for this conference would be, could we, like for the last 5 minutes, come up with some more questions? What's the most burning questions? What should we like ask ourselves or think about more thoroughly from tomorrow on in order to continue this conversation? Or as Michelle put it, like as assignments, what are the most burning questions?
Yeah, Ian.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
I just have one, which is a question about solidarity. How can we think about psychologize it? We think about solidarity as our activity in support of people that we don't know, that we've never met, that we don't make to be like us. How can we think about solidarity outside the frame of psychologization?
Thank you. Erica, please.
I'd like, someone asked me a question and I ticked answer this live by mistake. So I feel obliged to say something about it, but I think it connects to this question of solidarity. So the question was about our solidarity as senior academics to junior academics, which is perhaps a rather parochial question, but I think nevertheless important. And so this is to Stephen Stanley. So this is a communication that is a specific one to, in terms of solidarity to a named individual who I don't know. Hello, Stephen, I hope you're there. Which is part of and my answer is yes, take part in union activity and recognize as senior staff how demoralizing and destabilizing the current context is, and what the difficulty of staying and trying to stay in to struggle for a university position, and of living with precarity and how we need to mobilize across sectors, etc. That's my answer, which isn't an unusual answer, but I suppose it's an example of trying to build some solidarity across great unknowns in a way that builds a particular communication across some axis of difference, presumably many, and the concept of solidarity does combine together the idea of the sort of known and distinguishable and an entity that lies beyond that, which when I was thinking about this question, I found quite a fruitful one to think about. Because we have to relate to a collectivity that isn't just scary and something and paranoid, but is something that we can co-create, can forge together, and can participate in and take responsibility for.
Mark?
What is most important to do? as psychologists and as human beings at this particular historical juncture, recognizing that we'll likely have somewhat different answers to that question. That's what I find myself asking.
Closing it?
Are you?
No, you are running. Sunil.
I mean, I want to take up the question where, Michelle Fine provocatively asked us, and I think some of that was in Ruthellen as well as Mark Freeman's question too, is sort of, whom are we accountable for when we think about building a vision of psychology? And that is, as we are collectively thinking through building a vision of psychology, for me, the question has been very essential, is like sort of whose voices do we center or keep centering? Even when we claim to say that let's bring other voices, let's create solidarity, who's making that claim at what time? And who gets heard? And that's to me been one question which I keep bringing. When academics in the global north make a claim to solidarity, it has a very different ring when people, say in India or Bangladesh or Pakistan, are making a claim to solidarity. Usually those claims are dismissed or they don't frame. That's what Nandita's point was. So that kind of goes to the question of knowledge production. So can we be so self-reflexive of our own power that in claiming solidarity, that we don't end up only speaking to ourselves because we are centering our own voices? So I do hope that we find a way, as we move forward, that we really find a way to be genuinely in dialogue or in communication. Because if we acknowledge, as decolonizing psychology does, whether you want to decolonize psychology as a discipline or speak about its history, part of it has been is to kind of point out, oftentimes when we speak about liberating psychology, we also kind of end up putting them in similar kinds of shackles. We end up kind of reproducing the status quo. So I want us to be mindful as we, whether you want to call it mutual aid, mutual collaboration, whether you want to call it that, there are deep existing power asymmetries that we speak from. And knowledge production is part of that. So can we be conscious of that even moving forward collectively? Whether it's the epidemic of racism, epidemic of social inequality, epidemic of biology, of racism, either whichever your entry point is when we reconstitute or rethink, we kind of broaden the definition of psychology, not psychologize, but really have a broadened way of thinking about what psychology is, many of you have said. But here I'm more thinking about what other voices do you want to bring to the table?
Thank you so much. I really hope we can continue this conversation. Thanks again for participating and for this wonderful conclusion of the conference.
After 2 hours, it's time to say goodbye. 11 days and 2 hours.
Thank you very much. Thank you for all the work you've done.
Martin, thank you so much.
Thank you for a great session. See you on Slack. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.